Good morning, friends. Good afternoon. Good evening. Hi, Carlos. Hi, Giancarlo. Nice to see you here. Austin.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I'm doing some AV configuration.
Yeah, do it. We're just sitting around chit-chatting until people file in. Welcome, Kianga. Looking forward to talking to you today. I think it's today. Matthew, I think you're going to be speaking. I'm going to invite you up. Welcome, Gregory. All right, we're starting to fill in. Austin, I think you're guiding our erstwhile guide today. You would like to take us away? Looks like Gregory's unmuted as well.
Sure, I'll start, and then maybe Greg, if you want to jump in and say something, we can go. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you, hear you this beautiful Thursday. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy for the invite to co-host this conversation with Matthew today. So just making sure that Matthew has speaking privileges would probably be wise to do.
Yeah, I invited him up.
Great. Okay, cool.
I invited him up. Yep.
Well, I mean, I guess, Greg, do you want to say anything before I cue it up?
Well, first, I just sort of, Matthew, if you haven't done a Spaces, you've got to use your phone. They are sneaky, trying to get us all to have the Twitter app on our phone. So if you were like me and joining this from your laptop or desktop because you don't want Twitter all up in your phone business, you might need to just go download the app. Friendly weekly reminder that I download the app for this call and then delete it shortly thereafter in order to maintain my sanity and disconnection from Twitter in my just like day to day.
And how's that working for you?
Sometimes I forget to delete it and then I get sucked in and I find myself in like these silly moments where I'm like, wanting to share my thoughts or do a hot take on the crazy carbon news or something like that. And yeah, it's lovely when it's not on my phone and my impulse doesn't sort of suck me into 5 minutes of scrolling or something like that. So yeah, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's like 5 minutes that doesn't exist all of a sudden. It's like, whoop, that was a wrinkle in time.
Just
back
boom,
to reality.
Just gone. The AI has harvested my time.
Yeah. Thanks for all the training you provided to whatever model.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I'm doing good. I'm really excited for this conversation with Matthew. The work that he's doing is really interesting, and Austin, I'm excited to jam with you. Austin and I have been playing a little bit thanks to Gary over at DreamDAO with some
Thanks, Gary.
GPT-3 art stuff over on Midjourney, which is sort of, orthogonal to this conversation about active inferencing, but seems sort of related to me.
Oh yeah, I like the comparison between the two. That's nice.
Yeah, well, and so excited about that, and I was just sharing in the community dev call yesterday, which is a bi-weekly thing where the R&D Inc. team sort of gathers with validators and other community members, and we go through the public roadmap and some other things. I was sharing in that space and wanted to share on to the community here on Twitter that, and I think Austin and I are going to be collaborating on this, but I'm starting to work on some art collections. I'm doing it in a couple of different ways, but essentially I'm starting to generate some art to be used for project fundraising. So this is all stuff sort of starting to generate collections that land stewards and scientists and other people who aren't going to get deep into geeking out on whether it's AI art or landscape art or just other forms of digital art, can kind of maybe pick from some beautiful crafted images and use them to generate project funding. because one of the big things that's really important, it looks like Matt just hopped off, so I bet he'll be hopping on with his phone now. One of the big things that we're recognizing at Regen, especially in the midst of this drama, which I actually want us to talk about a little bit, but this drama related to Vera and tokenizing, existing credits and getting them on the blockchain, all this stuff, none of that changes the central fact, which is that we need to be able to flow financial capital into the hands of land stewards for stewarding ecosystems regeneratively. And that's like the primary thing that has to happen. And somehow that gets missed completely in the big swirl of all of this. And doing that well isn't that easy, right? Because we do not have a lot of the infrastructure that's needed in order to do, for instance, direct payments incumbent upon verification of ecological health, for instance, right? Currently, the system is very bureaucratic. There's all these, the land stewards never get paid directly. And if money does trickle down, it's just a fraction of what is being valued on the market. And so this is sort of like Gregory's rant and ramble leading up to Matthew getting up on stage and the conversation that Austin and Matthew are going to have, which I'm super excited about, as two big-brained humans. Just, I'm super excited about anything. I was sort of talking about NFTs. We're shifting gears into active inferencing. Any of these little tools, these primitives, as people in the blockchain space like to talk about it, or people in mechanism design like to talk about, any of these primitives that can be assembled by humans in order to create new and novel ways to value ecological health and to invest in it together are really important and exciting. And I think we need to keep our eye on that sort of trajectory. And that's why this conversation coming up with Matthew and Austin is super exciting to me, because active inferencing is, I think, and we're exploring this, and Matthew will talk about the research he's doing, but my intuition is that active inferencing is really going to be a huge unlock to make the sort of complexity of living systems able to integrate into the social process of determining value and investing that value into something. So I'm going to pass it back over to you, Austin, after that ramble, and just stoked about this conversation.
Yeah, me too. While we're here, just to say thanks for that mid-journey invite, Gregory. If you're talking about like having Twitter on your phone and losing 5 minutes just to like doom scrolling, I think I lost about half of my productive day yesterday, just generating images with Midjourney. So super excited to see what comes out of it. It produces some pretty cool stuff. If you give it sovereign bioregional regenerative economies, it gets it. I mean, I don't know what one might think it is and what getting it means, but it seems to get it, which is pretty fun.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah, so that's a wormhole that's pretty intense. And I guess I'll cue up the conversation today, because today we're going to be talking with Matthew, who I've actually never met. Matthew, hi, I'm Austin. I work at the Regen Foundation. I'm a big fan of active inferencing, and stoked for you to be here. Maybe I'll kind of set the stage just with a few comments, and then Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then maybe I'll sort of cue it up from there. We can talk about these like little tools that are helpful towards the process of regenerative economics, or refi, or you could call them primitives. And the topic for today, active inferencing, seems like a pretty big tool, and it does not seem very primitive. It seems really sophisticated and really exciting and interesting. So that's my kind of like splash. So Matt, maybe I'll just ask you to turn on your mic and introduce yourself, and then I'll follow up with some questions.
Hey, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
You and some beautiful birds. It's lovely.
Yeah, I'm here in downtown Hood River, and I'm kind of by a road, so hopefully you guys can hear me all right. There's some birds and some car noises, so there might be a little bit of background. But my name is Matthew Perkowski. I have a bit of a winding path. My original background was in evolutionary psychology and agent-based modeling. That's where I learned software development, then went through a career in software development for quite some time, but have always maintained a passion for understanding modeling and thinking through complex systems, and trying to encapsulate those to the extent they can be encapsulated in software models and mathematical models. And recently, that has led me to this project with Regen Network and active inferencing. And so I'm sure we can unpack this at any level of depth that people are interested in doing, but just at a very high level, active inferencing is a way of understanding how agents or how certain systems use information to generate probabilistic models of the world and of the causal structures of the world and how they update those models across time. There's a metric that generates called free energy, and that's modeled on the idea of free energy in physics, which is a pretty deep concept as well. And we can unpack that if we want to or not. But that's sort of my background and how I was led to this particular project. And I think there's a lot of interesting applications in terms of how to use that modeling paradigm for governing or developing or iterating on models in various parts of the regen ecology, in terms of either modeling ecological systems directly or trying to understand the interface between certain financial systems in some sort of crypto or DeFi space, and how that intersects with desired behaviors or incentives in ecological stewardship. So all that kind of stuff is within the purview of what I'm looking at right now and the initial research I've been doing. So excited and interested to talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you just kind of gave a nice arc for maybe what I was thinking the conversation could process through. I mean, maybe talking a bit about these generative ecological models and understanding like ecological state through active inferencing, and then we'll get into some space that's definitely like outside of my wheelhouse, but I'm super curious about with some of the work of active inferencing related to DeFi and automated market makers related to some of the tools, which seems like a really exciting and sort of expansive application of it. Maybe to start us off, I think to give all, because we have different sort of familiarities with the people who show up to this space, I want to kind of set the stage to talk about ecological state and why that matters within a project like this. And it's as much to explain why we want to understand what's happening with the biosphere, but also to sort of introduce the kind of language that surrounds some of the work around active inferencing. So, the reason that we're talking about this idea of what is going on, how do we infer about the health or the well-being of a particular bioregion or of a particular plot of land, is because this larger idea of the regen registry runs on the notion that we're making attestations about ecological state, that a kind of proof of regeneration is necessary in some form, but how that's done has to be circumstantial, and it's contextual and multifaceted. So there isn't a one size fits all way to make a claim about like the current health or the well-being of an ecosystem, but that active inferencing is a way to support some really sophisticated understandings about ecological state in ways that are hard to measure, with sort of state factors that are difficult to do sort of conventional analysis on. So we're talking about this because in order to build a regenerative economic model, we have to base that in what's actually happening on the ground. And we could use remote sensing to do that. We can use like ground truth, like eyesight. We could use wireless sensor networks to do that, some combination of all of them. And so active inferencing is a means with which we can attest to what's happening in a particular plot or subplot on the Earth's surface. Matt, does that seem like a fair kind of like really broad claim of what it does?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a fair assessment of how we're trying to use it or apply it at this moment. I mean, one really interesting aspect about active inferencing from a sort of philosophy of knowledge or epistemology perspective is that so many other modeling systems throughout this history of cybernetics or history of trying to understand and formally model natural systems have made a lot of assumptions about what kind of state, as you're talking about these ecological states, what kind of state is accessible or directly observable. And it's actually become quite obvious through a lot of artificial intelligence research and robotics work that it's actually very hard to understand or directly perceive the causal structure in front of you. And you have to basically access that always indirectly. And so one of the interesting things about active inference is, it takes that as a fundamental axiom because it emerged out of the neuroscience research paradigm as a general modeling toolkit. It takes as axiomatic the fact that the world and the states of the world must be accessed through sensory modalities, and those sensory modalities are never error-free, right? Never noise-free. Think of consciousness itself, like our eyes or our ears could, in theory, betray us, but overall, they do give us a picture of the world that can be useful as we incorporate it into our understanding of how certain behaviors or how certain causal structures unfold around us, and also how we can act upon that world to both confirm our understanding of how the world works and to pursue goals with respect to those states and the causal structure. And so all of that is quite relevant to something like Regen Network in the sense that many actors are going to be making claims about not only the particular levels of the states that they're targeting for change, but also their theory of change around what kind of actions they could do to change those states and push those states in the ecology towards a more desirable target. And doing so, it can also give you information, about how well you understand that causal structure, how well you understand the ecology, how good your model is. And active inference is a great paradigm to allow for all of that. And so, we're taking steps in that direction right now. It's at the beginning of the project, but I think the match between the goals of this project and the innate or the sort of axiomatic structures of the paradigm of modeling itself are really in line. So it's a really nice match as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it emerged from a neuroscientific context, and now we're talking about it as a generalizable kind of model describing ecological conditions. And so it seems really exciting. I'm curious if you could kind of give like a layperson's explanation about how observations can be used to like is part of this generative model to get at things which are not observable. Can you walk us through in sort of like plain terms what the process is to be able to make understandings of state around factors that are not directly measurable? Like how might that work?
Yeah, so I mean, directly describing the transformations or the inferences themselves are, the best language for that is linear algebra. But in terms of just general language, the easiest way to think about it is fundamentally there's a Bayesian probability structure involved here. And the thing about Bayes' rule is that, I'm not sure how familiar that is, or if that's inbounds or not for layman's definition. But the whole idea is based on observations you see in the world, and a certain understanding of how likely something you think is in the world to be the case. So, like, let's say that you get sensory information that says you see an apple, and then there's some general understanding of how likely you are to see apples in your day-to-day existence, and the fact that you think that you're seeing that apple then impacts the degree to which you believe you will see apples in the world and moving forward. And so that's this general Bayesian paradigm, and you can get into the details of that if you want. But the hard thing about that, applying that Bayes theory, because Bayes theory is pretty simple generally, but the hard thing about applying that to more complex systems or applying that through the world more generally is that there's something called the posterior probability, and then there's a process called marginalization that you have to do to get that. And the issue with marginalization is that you're kind of supposing that in order to do that about an arbitrary state of the world, you would have to suppose that you were able to get data about all hypothetical hypotheses for the causal structure of that probability. And that's really hard. And so a huge probabilistic field, a huge field of probability and statistics has been, really interested in researching how to, mathematically get at that problem. And active inference has a really nice and elegant way in which it piggybacks on certain ideas in thermodynamics. So it piggybacks on this idea of free energy, which is, in thermodynamics, it's a measure of the energy available in a system to actually perform work. So the amount of accessible or usable energy in that system that can be directed toward some other process. And this paradigm in active inference takes that and applies it to the concept of behavior and information in a way. So it's almost kind of like saying, instead of just performing those calculations directly on the Bayesian mathematics and saying, what are these probabilities of all the possible hypotheses in the world, it places a constraint on that with a very specific mathematical framework and allows you to sort of get at that idea of, how likely your, what is the likely causal structure given the observations that you see in the world. And, it also allows you to use actions on the world. So, based on how you actually want to, let's say I grabbed the apple and rotated the apple around just to check and make sure that it had a stem and it looked like an apple. And maybe I bit the apple and tasted the apple. All of those actions can also add to my certainty, add to my understanding of what an apple is, how likely it is to be in the world, how it relates to other processes in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope that's a decent. I'm trying not to go too technical, but the thing with active inference is it is a really deep mathematical modeling paradigm, and so sometimes, without terms of art, it is a little hard to really get directly at it. But I hope that's a decent overview.
That's great. Austin, do you mind if I just take a crack at grounding this into?
Please.
Yeah. So I guess what's going on here? I want to ground it in an example that's super pertinent and meaningful at this present moment for many of our listeners around, so recently there's a kerfluffle, a big deal around carbon credit registries, and the biggest carbon credit registry, Vera, saying people can no longer tokenize the carbon that's produced on this registry. Going back a step, what does Vera do? Vera is a institutional sort of like truth. It's an institution that is claiming to be able to verify that a carbon credit has value. And so there's an epistemology around that. The epistemology, or that is to say, how knowledge is generated in the Vera paradigm. Knowledge is being generated by sort of an expert who there's like a body of experts, and what they say is true on that registry system, right? And there's a sort of like an institutional bubble which is accepted by corporations and other things. We can see that this approach sort of fails a lot because sometimes the experts who have been vested with this ability to say something is true, like a carbon credit is good, have other incentives. And so there's like institutional incentives that maybe lead to this sense-making approach, not really working very well. Like somebody might hand you an orange and insist that it's an apple. And if you don't have the faculties to sort of weave it back to what Matt's talking about, this analogy, if you don't have your own faculties to be able to look at that and, maybe take a bite to test it and play with it, you may, just accept that an orange is an apple. Okay, so coming back to why are we interested in this conversation? Why is it important as a community to be educating ourselves about these terms of art, about this approach of active inferencing, and more broadly, sort of epistemology? How do we generate knowledge about ecological state as a community? And what does that have to do with carbon credits? Well, this is a step these are explorations, research, and development that is trying to ground an open source system for people to be able to make claims, back those claims up with simple evidence, and for the rest of the community to be able to make an assessment about the level of uncertainty that should be, that is baked into the claim, so that you're not saying, is it completely false or is it completely true? You're able to make a claim that says, within this level of uncertainty, we think that this is true. And that's a really foundational, that being able to bring a concept of uncertainty into a claim system and into a crediting system and into a marketplace around ecological health, for instance, we really think is essential, because it enables lower cost, lower certainty claims to coexist with higher cost, higher certainty claims, and for people in the market to be able to discern between the two. And markets are really fantastic around pricing in uncertainty if that uncertainty is transparent, right? And so having this formal statistical, formalized mathematical approach to baking in how claims are made, how data is dealt with, is just enormously exciting to be getting to this level of formality. So hopefully that sort of grounds it in the present moment. This conversation, I believe, is really foundational to what a world looks like when we're operating with a don't trust, verify approach to ecological state, and the markets, the sort of regenerative finance markets that can be built on things like quantification of ecological health. So hopefully that's helpful, contextualization.
Yeah, and I think why we're talking about this on Regenerati News Hour related to the Regen Network is that the part of the core to the project of building a registry is to create methodologies which attest and verify ecological state to allow eco credits to be minted on top of them, rather than relying upon a third party like Vera or some other entity which has its own standards. We are actively exploring and working with the stack on a social, technical, ecological level of building new kinds of eco credits. So we're not just taking what Vera has created, but building new kinds of eco credits so active inferencing becomes really relevant. And this is an ignorant question. Is there any existing registry which has integration in it around uncertainty, quantifiable uncertainty, or is it all
No
system to be complete?
No, there's no concept of a reporting around uncertainty at sort of like a methodological level. Scientists sometimes will be able to answer uncertain, the statistical level of certainty that they have, but at a registry level and a claims level, that is not currently sort of an operating. You're not going to buy a carbon unit that has a level of certainty attached to it. The level of certainty is assumed to be 100%. And there's sort of an assumption that the methodology developer and the institution has somehow dealt with uncertainty and sort of simplified that away so that it's invisible and it has been taken care of.
Yeah, and just to kind of pivot on that, or to extend that point, a really fascinating aspect about the active inferencing paradigm for modeling is that it doesn't actually, it's very specific in how it is applied to a given model, but it doesn't dictate how you generate the model that you think or that you're trying to examine or experiment with. So what I mean by that is many people could, just like you're saying, Vera or others could arbitrarily say, oh, we have a model of how these states work and how different people's actions on an ecology or on a given piece of land will impact that land's states or these states that we concern that are underwriting this economic asset, this carbon credit, and maybe 10 different companies do that. And how do you arbitrate between those different models? And there's no extrinsic connection or way of getting underneath those if people are just disagreeing about certain arbitrary aspects of their models and it's not getting to a deeper level of the constraints that are governing all of these systems. And active inference is fascinating because of the fact that it is so generally applicable, and the way that you verify these principles of uncertainty is totally standardized across any kind of model. So those same 10 companies in theory could create their hypotheses about how this works, and then you could apply this active inferencing statistical method across those, and it would give you metrics in terms of present levels of uncertainty, but also even more importantly, based on future actions that they're taking as you get data over time, as sensory systems are giving you more information about that land, as people are submitting different proposals in terms of how to update or how to improve that ecology state based on whichever one of those models they subscribe to, you would actually get a different signature. You'd get a different pattern of how well each of those hypothetical models, those generative models, those causal hypotheses about the world, how well they're using the information that they have and the actions that they can take to reduce their uncertainty about the world, about these ecologies. So you actually get I wouldn't go so far as to call it objective, because the fact is that the axiom of this model is that nothing is objective in this sense. You don't get direct access to the state, but you do get a metric that can be applied as close to objectively across different hypotheses as possible.
Intersubjective, and you can, it's sort of,
like intersubjective integrity or intersubjective coherence, right?
Yeah.
It provides that ability, like you said, grounding is a very good way of thinking of it. Grounding the dynamics of these supposed processes that we're saying, oh, I think I understand how the world works, and this is what I want to do about it. Well, how do you measure that? How do you even get at beginning to talk about that coherently across different people's hypotheses?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of just science, right?
Yeah,
right?
It is, right? It is trying to come together using observations in a coherent way to understand the extent to which we do understand the world and the extent to which we don't understand the world, and trying to be able to, if not with total precision, gain some grasp on that so that we can move toward, functional goals and values that we have in the world. But yeah, it is a very deep articulation of the scientific method as such.
Right, as applied to making claims about ecological state, so that we're not stuck just assuming that any claim is objective or is just significant, but we actually have a spectrum of like degrees of significance, or the uncertainty of the claim is quantifiable. And that seems really relevant in the wake of very vague understanding of the additionality of certain carbon tons that have could be described as zombies, etc. But that there's such a thing as quality involved here, that not all are created equal. So it's super exciting. I've watched and like read some papers and watched several lectures on this. I'm curious if you can bring us into some of the like parts of the biosphere here. Like, are we looking at like crop patterns or grazing patterns or storm patterns in order to understand something about a plot of land? Can you give us, like, rather than describing them as parameters and factors, can we describe this in the language of like abiotic and biotic things, like the kind of entities we know that compose ecosystems? Is it, if like, I'd love to hear an example walking through, say, a grazing example or something like that, so we can root these sort of parameters and terms into the ecosystems.
Sure. So, at this point, that would be hypothetical, just because of the fact that we're at the beginning of developing the mapping between this model and more general ecological systems. So we haven't gotten into applying it to extremely granular cases yet. But you could certainly like you could have one way you could apply something like this is you would have an underlying understanding of various measurements that you would take of the soil. So you could have, at the very basic level, you could take your NPK levels, but like that's a really coarse grain measurement. You could also do something like, you could start understanding what you think about the association between those different chemical signatures, and perhaps like the presence of mycorrhizal fungi of different species or something like that. Whatever causal model of that soil structure you wanted to hypothesize, right, as the underlying states you're interested in. Maybe you want to increase the soil complexity or the density of a particular nutrient, or the presence of some factor, some hormone that was not necessarily being produced before, that requires some set of precursors that just weren't in the soil. You could create whatever model you wanted to create there, and then based on observations above surface and behaviors above surface that you are taking or observing. So you could, anything from the visual signature of that land, so like an image that you take daily of a piece of that area, or any sort of chemical sensor, soil temperature sensor, any of these types of measurements that are far easier to obtain than actually going and taking soil samples and having scientists explicitly look at exactly what's in that soil in terms of, first of all, it's expensive enough to do that with just basic chemical signatures or levels of molecules like nitrogen or phosphorus, if you're trying to do it at high resolution across a large amount of samples. But then you talk about something like, you're saying like mycorrhizal complexity. Well, that's very difficult to measure directly, and we don't even necessarily have a good proxy understanding of how you would quantify that, but you can represent it as a probabilistic factor. And in theory, based on these other observations that you do have access to, you can begin to infer, based on your model and your observations and the actions you're taking, you can begin to infer the relationships between these factors, these causal relationships, as opposed to saying, we understand the exact dynamics and exactly what's happening. You can begin to understand, how they are structured or probabilistically related to one another. I'm trying to make this specific, but we haven't, like right now, we've been working at a higher level and we're kind of drilling into this. So in the future, we will definitely have more specific and concrete models, but hopefully that gives us kind of an idea of how it would get more specific. Yeah.
No, thanks. I mean, I understand that it's a hypothetical project, and so that you're being a good sport and like humoring these questions, because I know a lot of people on the call are curious about how this might apply to their regenerative practice or to their particular bioregion where there's just a tremendous diversity. And, I think that it'll be really exciting to see in the future how you all at Bioforms, what your approach is in terms of making this available, how it's released, how high is the wall around the garden, or no wall whatsoever. So
well, I mean,
super
I
exciting.
feel like there won't be too high of a wall. I mean, like when
Right.
people interact with it more directly later on, it would be in the form of saying, let's say that you have a proposal and you have some idea of what you're going to do. Maybe you're going to change your composting practices or X, Y, or Z, and you'd have some idea of how that would increase your capacity to capture carbon, and then across time, some basic measurements, as opposed to current, more in-depth auditing processes that would be also more expensive to implement, like having someone actually come out to the land and test the soil at some high frequency. In theory, there could be, you'd have your hypothesis, you would have, other pieces of evidence that could be more easily taken, via phone or camera systems or things like that. And you could then therefore have a much higher degree of certainty associated with, whether or not you have a good understanding of how you are impacting your land, how you're improving that state. And then that could increase the relative price of that carbon credit, right? Because there's greater confidence, less uncertainty, greater confidence, by this standard, in terms of the fact that this whole network, or this Regen network, is now bringing many people in who are playing by these same rules of reducing uncertainty in terms of how they are achieving their goals of improving, biomass density or carbon capture capacity across this wide swath of behavioral patterns. And many of those behavioral patterns are now possible to unlock at smaller scales where it wouldn't have made economic sense before, because it would have been like cost prohibitive or time prohibitive for the person managing the land or
right.
farming that land.
And that's huge. That
Yeah.
one of the largest, like we were talking about smallholds or vulnerable economies, more vulnerable populations, the overhead cost to see if regeneration has happened, can be prohibitively expensive, and basically be a non-starter. So the sort of quantifiable uncertainty coupled with the fact that this lowers the barrier to entry to economic overhead, and who has access to being able to make attestations of state is super, super exciting. I want to give a second to before you open up to questions later on. I want to give a moment for you to describe a little bit like how this touches DeFi space, and what some of the early thoughts or broad level, you can speak at whatever level of specificity you think is appropriate around how active inferencing can relate to like AMMs and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean that's another vein of preliminary research that we've just been getting some very initial findings on after developing some of these initial models. But the idea there is, why did these AMM liquidity provision or liquidity pools emerge? Well, they initially emerged specifically to solve the problem of the high degree of cost and transaction frequency that would be required to do a normal order book in a DeFi space, and so you create a algorithmic mechanism to do that instead. But the issue with those algorithmic mechanisms that they have introduced, so A times B equals K is the traditional, and there are others like stable swap, and the whole point of those is though to be able to understand the relative value of two or more different coins or representations of value. Let's call them coins for now, based on supply and demand and ostensible value, and then just compute that algorithmically. But the thing with that is, obviously, it can get quite volatile. And whenever you're sort of arbitrarily trying to structure the relation of two or more coins in the presence of the market, in the presence of arbitraging agents or people who are just trying to be extractive or play an extractive game, it becomes quite risky. You can see very quickly that, there's multiple examples in the market of what's the one most recently? Something
UST.
Capital. Well, no, something Capital that just got blown up because there's like a hack in which essentially they were gifted a huge amount of one particular coin, and that put their AMM into a state that was not programmed for, and that made them vulnerable to a massive $13 million dollar extraction, and that sort of put them underwater. So, for example, these mechanisms are kind of fragile if they're just computed without respect to any extrinsic reality, any extrinsic set of circumstances that would help to understand if people are actually playing a game that is pointed towards something real and valuable and desirable, or if they're just playing that extractive game. And so we've been experimenting with this idea of, well, if you have an ecological model that's under this modeling paradigm of active inference, and you have this free energy metric across time in terms of whether your certainty levels about that reality, that ecology, are increasing or decreasing, could that be coupled with a mechanism like an AMM to provide a kind of buffer or ballast system such that you don't have as much of that arbitrary volatility, such that it's less subject or vulnerable to manipulation and extraction. And so, we've just been doing
Question about that, Matthew. So as I was watching some of your guys' work, your summary of some of your work on this recently, one of my questions was really around or my sense of things was that basically what you're talking about is coupling an active inferencing model of, for instance, the economic value of carbon drawdown or something like that to the bonding curve that an AMM is operating on, so that bonding curve is actually responsive not just to buy and sell orders, but has a third variable which is related to something that is extrinsic. Am I getting that right, or am I missing something there?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, that's on that's on target. It's not necessarily. It's taking into account in terms of the. If you kind of think of like the simple case with two different coins on either side of a scale, you're sort of bounding the movements of one of those, and the justification for bounding the movements of the volatility of the movements of one of those, like by either doing something like a burn or a mint, or other possible ways of bounding that that price fluctuation or volume fluctuation on one side. The justification for that is that it's actually attached to something that is a real representation of an ecological state, and that there's intrinsic value in reducing the uncertainty associated with that ecology, and our understanding of how to steward that ecology. And so that in theory attracts people who care about the long-term value of that state, of that ecology, of that vision. And then insofar as those people care about that in the long term, that basically provides greater stability within this AMM mechanism by coupling that free energy metric, that's an open, transparent metric, over this system, right? It's not just saying we're arbitrarily changing the price fluctuations, which some algorithms do, in terms of arbitrarily deciding how much to burn or mint based on a desired sort of state of the AMM itself. So it's kind of just a self-referential structure. Like, we want the AMM to be in this particular stable state, so we're going to do this because we want it to be in this particular stable state. And this is saying more like, no, this is an actual mechanism coupled to a real extrinsic system, people performing real work to improve a real ecology, because that's in line with the community's values. And to the extent that that community can maintain that investment and that care for those values, it can help to stabilize this liquidity dynamic via something like an AMM. So that's the general overall idea. And we're still experimenting, obviously not in the real market yet. We're experimenting with models to see if this could work. There's some early promising signs, and then we're going to be increasingly working towards, putting this on some test nets and seeing what the actual real world behavior begins to look like.
Awesome. I mean, for those who are listening, is there a way that they can kind of follow along, or how to stay up to date with sort of these applications, trying on test nets, seeing how it works with AMMs? How can folks keep abreast of what's the state of the art of active inferencing?
State of the art of active inferencing, there are a few different groups out there for that in general, but this specific application, Bioform's lab just created a Discord, so we could share that. I don't have that off the top of my head right now, but we did, that is a goal of the near term, to start bringing in more people from the community, any interested observers and any interested contributors there. That's going to be the primary point of contact. Outside of that, as we make progress, we're going to be sharing that progress, but currently we don't yet have a website or anything like that up, because this has just been a sort of off-the-grid research project thus far. But I think it's going to be increasingly visible, and as that visibility increases, we'll definitely let people know. And the primary channel for that information release will be Discord at first, and then I'm sure Greg will also broadcast that when we're a little bit more ready to take things into a more visible space.
Definitely, and Matt has been kind enough to offer to continue to come and share updates here on the Regenerati News Hour and Twitter Spaces. And I'm also thinking we'll probably do, some sort of recorded Zoom slideshow sort of thing periodically as important as milestones are met and work kind of continues, just to sort of be able to share this back and then point back to the Bioforms Discord and maybe active channels in the Regen Discord, as this is applied more and more concretely to ecological state claims and crediting, etc.
Yeah, that'll be when it gets extremely interesting, when we actually are really digging into the specific models and applying the more general framework to Regen's use cases, and we'll be able to say a lot more that I think will just be easier for people to directly relate to, because it'll just be much more concrete at that point. Right now with the preliminary, it's been a bit abstract, but I'm looking forward to making it more applicable and more easy for people to digest in ways that are directly relevant to them over time.
Right, because at the moment you're sort of building a tool bench to be able to then apply this to more and more concrete circumstances, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so right now it's a lot of really deep abstract work, because of the fact that it has to have that flexibility to be able to then be used in concrete instances. And so a lot of it is engaging directly with the low-level libraries that were made accessible by the researchers and scientists that have been developing active inference. and trying to map those into more of the applied world. And so it's been a lot of that kind of work. And then the next phase is going to be, working with a lot of, the internal team at Regen to make this much more specific and concrete around Regen-specific economic incentives, Regen-specific goals, and ways that it sees ecologies, ways that it sees actual, projects with the goal of increasing carbon capture through alterations to complex systems. And then it'll be very grounded in those specific systems that Regen's targeting.
Super cool. Looking forward to the day when the sort of trad standards of Vera are trying to integrate the new credit methodologies with active inferencing onto their process, so that it's flowing from Web3 native registry back towards more like trad registries.
Love it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the thing as well. I mean, in theory, if this modeling toolkit works, like one thing that we haven't gotten too much into so far is that one of the beautiful aspects about this modeling paradigm is that it does provide the flexibility to have very complex multi-scale models, and also can model very different types of systems. So it is kind of like a interface that can help to standardize across many different kinds of models. And to the extent that those integrations gain from using this, like if we demonstrate that that's actually an advantage, then it kind of places a pretty significant pressure on other actors who aren't using this paradigm to adopt it, given the fact that the fundamental mathematics of this, if they do work in the world, essentially say that if you're reducing uncertainty under this paradigm, you're actually using the information in the world more effectively than others who aren't using this paradigm. So like you're actually maximizing your ability to use information to steward a system, and the whole constraint around this is like directed toward that effective use of information ecology in in an applied sense. And so I think it's a pretty powerful tool, and if it does work, it's going to provide a pretty strong incentive for others to adopt it.
One thing that I really love about this is, back in the day when we were first conceptualizing Regen Network, writing the white paper, we were referring to this whole process as ecological state protocols, or that is to say the protocols, models, and measurement protocols that allow us to understand ecological state and then make claims and issue credits or assets, right? And very early we realized that this is really quite nested. So you may have like a soil carbon methodology and a model that accompanies it, biodiversity or above ground biomass, and these are all linking into sort of global climate models and other things. And so, back then we were sort of groping around in the dark and, I sort of had some faith that there was going to be a way to create kind of a standard methodological approach across these different scales. But it's really just now, by intersecting with active inferencing, the work that Bioforms Labs is doing, the whole paradigm that Carl Friston has brought forth, that I'm starting to feel like, oh, this isn't actually, crazy. So I'm pretty excited.
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
not crazy.
It really is that core, like this core insight when you start looking at what they've been doing, that, all these different fields and the very unique ways that fields like as separate from, as different as physics and economics and neuroscience and behavioral psychology are from one another. There were different historical ways that, scientists had begun to represent what they believe to be the reality of those fields at least at a coarse grain level. But the interesting aspect about this active inferencing paradigm is that it unifies all of those insofar as it shows that each of those previous models in these different spaces are just special cases of this overall framework, because of the fact that what really ties all of nature's systems together is this capacity for any given system to use information and energy effectively in order to make sure that it is representing the world's causal structure in a way that allows for its further continued life and growth and evolution and regeneration. And so, it really is, I don't want to overstate the case, but it really does show an immense amount of promise as a unifying framework for approaching empirical analysis of systems in the world that we care about.
So, as there's about 5 minutes left, I'm sure Austin has some thoughts to wrap up. But I did want to ask you, Matt, or ask and make statements around, So this is a research and development project that Regen is contributing to, that other people are contributing to. What are there's been a lot of early conversation as this was going around licensing, around, who's owning this work, how is it going to be commercialized, right? As we've been thinking about all of this. And, instead of me just proclaiming, my strong beliefs on that, I'd love for you to answer for yourself and to the degree you can around bioforms, just like what's the approach here? How is this foundational research and development work? How are we focusing on bringing it to the world as a group of humans trying to sort of build this toolkit?
Well, I mean, the primary focus is on providing high quality tools that are open for as many people to use who wish to use this or who find value in this, right? Like the idea, we're doing this under MIT licensing at first, and specific instantiations and applications later down the road, people could use those economically, or they could take that in the directions they wish to take that. But fundamentally, at this base level, we want this to be an open platform. Anyone who has interest in this or the capacity to contribute to it, we welcome those contributions. Eventually, we're just getting the GitHub repo off the ground, but that's also going to be something to which, open source contributors could contribute if they wish to get involved. Also, and that's in line also with the general active inference community. There's a lab out of Berkeley run by Daniel Friedman, who's a really interesting and awesome guy. And they're also doing a bunch of open work right now. They're doing a textbook reading. That active inference textbook just came out. They have a lot of collaborative work, and they're very welcoming to anyone at any interest level, and who wants to apply this concept in any domain. They're doing, and they will be continuing to do these types of book read-throughs and lessons and education. And on our side, we're also going to be continuing to try to build this community out and develop as much of a high quality open foundation for this work, for this applied work of active inference in the real world as is possible. And then whatever comes from that, that will be up to others who apply this more specifically to their own problems, and they can develop whatever legal structures or sort of IP structures they wish around that. But fundamentally, we wish for this to be as open as possible to begin with.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, the potential for this type of tool to lower the barrier for more projects to launch methodologies and to be able to earn rewards for their stewardship is super, super exciting. And thanks for stewarding the stewards. I don't have any witty wrapping up comments other than this is super exciting, and I hope that this drives it in a direction where it decentralizes the sort of ownership of ecological state attestations, that more communities can have more capacity to own and build projects and build methodologies which reflect their needs and circumstances. I was kind of a bad host before, and I didn't really realize that I had request granting access. So Sophia, Timo, Josh, I'm sorry that I didn't grant you all the request. I have to hop off, but if people want to keep going, happy to hand over the reins. Otherwise, I think we'll probably call it.
I think.
Sorry.
Well, go ahead. I mean, if folks, I only see one request right now that just happened, so maybe I missed it because I was up later.
They were old requests.
Sorry, we missed folks. We usually do keep it to an hour. I see, it's always a shame when we got great engagement and an exciting topic. I am also going to need to hop. So I would,
We're
you
calling it.
know, yeah, I think we'll close down, but super grateful, Matt, for your time, Austin for your time, and everybody for hopping and listening. Hopefully, this has been sort of fruitful and sort of sparked some thinking. If you have questions or comments, feel free to just DM or reach out, and and we'll. This is going to be a living, ongoing conversation. So. Please chime in, and we'll be doing our best to kind of weave folks into this process of exploring how active inferencing might serve the refi space. So onward, and thanks everybody for your time.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Matt, for coming. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Dave, for hosting.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank
Look
you,
forward to sharing
everybody.
more as we progress.
Yes, we'll see you all next week, same time, same place. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.